Bob Good, and I'm the author of... Thank you very much. You're kind. I'm the author of The Science of Reincarnation. We just did a episode with Ancient Aliens, and we didn't get the logic in that presentation because there were too many directions being pulled. So we're going to give you the straight science on the science of reincarnation and do it with math so you understand it. So we're going to look at our total universe. The world population is 7.5 billion. Now, the numbers that follow are rough numbers, because when you look this up and they tell me Hindus, they tell me between 800 million and 1.2 billion. So Christians are roughly 30% at 2 billion, Muslims 15% at 1.6 billion, Hindus at 6%. The asterisk, and there should be an asterisk on Buddhist as well, indicates a belief in reincarnation, as do the Jews down here at 16 million and 2/1000%. Indigenous comprises indigenous religions across the swath of Africa through Asia. So that 900 million can be taken out of the calculation if you're doing this statistically, because it can be represented that at least a third of those believe in reincarnation anyway and will hit the mean. But the percentage of people in the world who believe in reincarnation are 33%. Now, that may be higher because Christians and Muslims may also hold individual beliefs on this. The question is why? Why do we have that kind of belief? What is our reality and what does science see? So if we apply a simple scientific method, observations, experiments, and theories, we can come up with some kind of logical answer to this question. In the last 40 years, there have been studies over a wide range of fields that have advanced this idea rapidly and dramatically to the point where there is religious and political resistance to it. So let's look at this through an easy explanation using broccoli. Now, what I found interesting is I've talked to everybody in your community, is being artists, so many people understood what fractals were. And there are two things you need to know about a fractal: iteration and self-similarity. So if I pull one of these buds off, the little tiniest one, and I'd like to pass around some broccoli so you can visually see the surface of the iteration. Here, just pass those around, and you can pull one of them off. There you. Well, hang on to it, because there may be more later. We may add to it. You want one here? Okay, good. So now here is your broccoli. Let's agree on what your broccoli is. Your broccoli is fractal based. Mandelbaum wrote the fractal nature the fractal nature of geometry in '86, and it applies to your heartbeat, iteration and self-similarity, how you look at things, iteration and self-similarity, because you have a structure of how your eye works. In a forest, if I measure the biggest tree's circumference and then the first branching circumference and the next branching circumference, I can actually infer how many large trees, middle trees, and small trees are in the entire defined forest. And they've proven that. So you have, according to this broccoli, one life from start to end. The current theory is that your consciousness is a result of the chemicals in your body, and everything that's happened to you happened on this broccoli. We all agree on that? Okay, good. Now, this is another broccoli. Now, this group is children who remember prior lives. It's been studied at the University of Virginia for the last 40 years, and the typical is that a child will say at 2 or 3 to his parents, "You're not my parents. I'm married. I want to go home." Or, "I want to go back to my own family. This is not my family." The prototypical one that really gave me a smile was a little girl in India who insisted she had to go 300 miles to the north to her family. So the parents finally just said, "Forget it, let's go." So they drive the kid. She's 4 years old. She drives him to her neighborhood. She turn left, turn right. There's my house. She gets out. She knocks on the door. 38-year-old guy answers the door. She says, "I'm your wife." He says, "No." He says, "I'm married." She says, No, I died. You're my husband. She says, who did you marry? And he says, so-and-so from down the street. And her response at 4 years old was, that bitch? Now, I'm going to give you 3 stories here. The first is James Leininger. James Leininger, at 2 years old, had nightmares of all the shooting. He drew pictures of aircraft carriers and guns. And when he had the nightmares, he would keep saying, the little man can't get out, the little man can't get out, and he'd kick his legs. Finally, at 3½, they take him to the Smithsonian in Washington, and there's film on this. You can see him pulling his little whatever, and he's going around a Corsair. And his father says to him, do you know what kind of plane that is? And at 3½, he says, yes, it's a Corsair, but the fuselage is on the wrong side. So they go to the museum director looks it up, it's correct. And at 3½ to 4, more information is coming out. Who's trying to kill you? The Japs. Were you on an aircraft carrier? Do you know its name? The Natoma. Well, the Natoma Bay was an aircraft carrier in the Philippines. So there is a reunion of veterans from the aircraft carrier in Natoma Bay, and they bring the 5-year-old to it now, and he walks in the door, and the first thing he says is, you're Bob Greenwald. At the end of this, you see people who are 85 years old and say, yeah, that was Frank Hudson. He said, I remember the day he died. He came up out of it, they hit him, and he went over on top and came down. Now, the University of Virginia tries to get to a case like this before the case is solved. And solving the case means that the child meets the family that she was a part of. So they can do it under controlled environment. I don't know if they did it in the Leininger case, but they have 2,500 cases accumulated over the last 40 years that they're coding for 400 variables. And it's hard for them to get funding because we're in a Baptist state of Virginia. And as you begin to weave through this science, you begin to get friction on in different categories. I want to give you 2 more in this category. Jenny Cockrell remembered a prior life and was tortured by it. She remembered dying, leaving 7 orphans. She was an English girl. The video came out in 2007. And by the way, if you see this ISOR site here, the International Association for the Science of Reincarnation, you can go to the site. On the home page will be the videos of these stories and links to them. So you can actually watch the videos of the people involved. And you can look at the guy from Virginia. In any event, so Susan Cockrell, she grew up poor. She gets married, she tells her husband about these ideas, these memories, and they finally book a trip to the Irish town that she claims she was from. She gets there, she drives through the streets, she sees the house, that she recognizes it, but it's a thatched roof, it's caved in. It's in total, it's dilapidated. So they go to town hall, and they find out who lived there, and some of the kids are still alive. So she calls one of them up. And now you cut to the kid. He's an 80-year-old guy, and he says, oh yeah, I remember the day she called. He said, she just said she had some questions and maybe I could help her. And she said, there were 3 pictures on the stairs going up the stairs. And he said, yeah, that's worth family. And she said, she remembered dust in the backyard. He said, that was when we were doing this. And then she hangs up, and he says, my wife said, who were you talking to? And he said, oh, that was my mom. Now, it's such certainty like this that people share stories that only they could know that leads some of this to say that this is an anomaly our science can't understand. The last one is Susan Ghanem, who at 4 years old found her prior family and identified the names of 15 relatives and their relationship to her late husband. So a 4-year-old girl walks through the door, looks at 15 people she's never seen, knows them by name, and knows the relationship. Now, the common features that we see in this category, it doesn't really matter what religion you are, because you change religions, you change genders. Younger souls seem to incarnate more in one gender, and older souls seem to incarnate 50-50 in both genders. And we find that information consistent through the coming categories. There's also death wounds. There'll be times, there was a boy in Indonesia who wanted to go back to his old family, but he had been murdered. And the scar, the birth scar that he bore, matched the murder wound that he suffered. And we see that repeatedly. There's a whole subcategory on that. So these people remember another Broccoli, and the people they interact with seem to accept that as the person. Now, in a population of 7.5 billion, 5% aggregate observation as a rough, safe estimate of people who have experienced some aspect of reincarnation, like these children. The common narrative is the most probable narrative, using an odds against chance basis on all the different narratives. So what we just heard about kids saying they were reborn, when we look at the other categories, we're going to end up with this being the most probable, and I don't want, what do they call it? Spoiling the ending? A spoiler alert? But yeah, spoiler alert. So how do these kids relate to the other categories? Before we leave this, I just want to tell you, in 1750, French farmers came to French scientists in Paris, and they said, "You see that rock? It fell from the sky." French scientists knew the farmers were lying. You could look in the sky, and you could see there weren't any rocks. It took 100 years before we understood the science of meteorites. Sometimes we see an effect before we understand the cause, and it's relating it to other causes of where we go from this. Okay, so now we're going to go to Glen Ford's Broccoli. And Carl, would you start to hand this out? Now this category, I have brought two of these so you could read the whole story. I'm going to blow through this as quickly as I can. Glen Ford was an American cowboy actor in the 1950s. And he was a peer of John Wayne. And so he was going to do a show with about Peter Herkos, who was a Dutch psychic. And as part of his prep for it, he agreed to be regressed. Now, this category is past life regression. So they hypnotized him, and he said, yeah, he lived another life in Scotland. He was a piano teacher. He didn't like the young ladies he taught piano to, and they said to him, well, can you sit down and play the piano? And he said, sure. And he sat down and he played the piano. He played Brahms, he played Chopin. When he came out of it, Ford denied ever being able to do it because Ford couldn't play the piano. And well, in that session, he identified his name and where he lived, so they went back to the town, and they found a gravestone of a person matching the name, matching the history of it. So now they took Ford up to UCLA. And when you see pictures of Ford and they're talking about it, he is totally blown away by it. He just doesn't understand it. You can see that look in his eye. And so they take him up to UCLA and they regress him to a period in the 1650s as a French lieutenant cavalry officer who was murdered in a lover's quarrel. When they regressed him, he spoke fluent French in a dialect that was like Brooklynese from a bad part of Paris in the 1650s. So it's one thing to try and fool people that you can talk French and say, because Ford couldn't talk French. But to do it fluently in that kind of dialect is totally, how do you account for that? So now, that is not alone. You have to understand the category. Past life regression, it's the only category in the science of reincarnation where people are making money. Brian Weiss, a Cornell-trained psychologist who heads the University of Miami's psychological department, regularly regresses people and has regressions. I've been the one. It's creepy that it works, but part of what he does is like remote viewing. And all of these are meditative states that you can't look at one and another, because there's simply different vibrational levels on the same string or different bandwidths. Okay, so I could have said 9. Weiss regressed 4,000 since 1980. Collectively, he and Newton have sold 3 million books. They confirmed the sex change feature of younger souls from the kids, and soul groups seem to stay together. So you've got a category that's fairly large here as a number but it's additive to the first number. And then you have people who have seen no broccoli. So first let's talk about no broccoli. No broccoli is when you're dead. There is no broccoli. You're not alive, you're not conscious, you can't be dead and alive, so when you're dead, there's no broccoli. But we have a category of people who've seen no broccoli, and those are NDEs. Those people who've had a near-death experience. They've been in a car accident, their heart stopped. Thomas Benedict Mellon is one of the more famous ones. What am I on here? He was dead for 1 hour and 45 minutes, terminal cancer, his body healed itself, and his narrative is perhaps the most complete. But Moody, who was the first one to study this, kept saying to his heart patients who he had resuscitated from near death, why do they all keep telling me the same lie? So what you have now is an odds against chance calculation, not only in this category, but then as a meta-analysis of the other categories, because we're seeing a variant of all of this. So the odds are you know somebody who's had an event like this, and we can certainly count them in that group. So the odds against chance is too great a measure when NDEs, kids, and past life regression all say the same thing. The odds against chance is too great a measure, but the definitive study has not been done. Now, I visited Columbus's grave when I was in Havana, Cuba, and then I visited Columbus's grave when I was in the Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, and then I visited Columbus's grave when I was in, I think, Toledo in Spain. So I said to the guy in the third place, why don't you just do the DNA test on his bones? And he said, someone would lose. He said, most people lie in peace, Columbus lies in pieces. If this becomes the standard, the religious view of our generation will totally change with the next one. So let's move on. Hang on a second. One more shot here. Oh, come on, baby. Here we go. Regarding no broccoli, I didn't do it justice. When I take the stories of the kids and the stories of the NDEs, they describe the order in no broccoli as first transition. I'm sorry, homecoming is the first step. Newton, one of the researchers, reports that his subjects meet deceased relatives, as do those who have near-death experiences. A similar experience is also reported by Weiss. The arriving soul can be met by a guide. Orientation is a period of adjustment from corporeal form to a spiritual one. Newton makes the point that no subterfuge or deception exists in a telepathic world. Souls are not judged but rather evaluated. At times, Newton, one of the psychologists, talks directly to the returning soul's guide. Transition is a term both used by Weiss and Newton to describe what was reported to them. Each soul has a home group with other souls. And it wouldn't surprise me that we're looking at a home group of souls, because there is a frequency or a bandwidth here that is common. The commonality of the word usage. Okay, next thing, placement is the term they use to describe the soul's level. According to him, there are 6 levels of souls that indicate advancement, whether you're on the 6th grade or the 12th grade. What I want you to see is not so much the structure of no broccoli, but I want you to see the ordered nature that it's reported to us by 3 disparate groups that couldn't possibly, a 3-year-old next to a 72-year-old heart attack victim, each giving a similar kind of story, defies a statistical analysis. And that's the issue with this when viewed collectively. Life selection describes the time when the soul must once again leave the sanctuary of the spirit world for another trip. Then there's choosing the body, embarkation, and rebirth. So that pretty much gives you the observations group. But there's another group when we do experiments. And that's one where a broccoli we have pictures of. Now, you all know about meditation. Clairvoyance was proved, I'm sorry I'm moving around for the tape. Clairvoyance was proved in the early 70s in the field of archaeology. J. Norman Emerson was professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, having given a life to archaeology and the study of Oneida Indians. And he connected with somebody who had been a protege of Edgar Cayce, or at least familiar with him. It was a garage mechanic by the name of John McMullen. And the two of them worked together where Emerson would take McMullen to a site like this, and McMullen would walk around and he'd say, the fire pits were over there, the waste area was over there, the burial ground was over there, and they would dig and they would find it. So he gave Emerson a piece of argillite that they'd found in the bottom of a post hole, and he said, well, who carved this? And now he's touting the garage mechanic, McGonagall's ability to say the right thing, and he says this was carved by a black man. And there were no black men that existed in northern Ontario in the 1860s. It wasn't in the population. In a subsequent study, and then they went to other psychics, and other psychics said, yep, the same thing. Then there was a totally unrelated anthropological study being done on blood types, and in the tribe that they said had the black man, they found the DNA marker for a black forebearer in that tribe. And ultimately they tracked this back to Africa. The point being is that we had DNA proof that clairvoyance works. And then Princeton got involved, and Princeton ran 250,000 people through the following study with a variety of variants over a period of 25 years. They programmed a computer to produce randomly a series of zeros and ones through the course of an hour. But the random would be 0001, 001111, something like that. And they interfaced you with the computer by showing you a picture of a boat and a tree. And they said to you, we want you to make the computer, solely with your intent, produce more trees than boats. And everyone was able to make the computer produce 52% trees, 48% boats. If you had a husband and wife team, the variant could be 54-46. And if you had two women, they might get an extra percentage point in strength, but in the wrong direction. Now, they shut down that program in 94 or 95, having had it replicated by other studies so that we can accept this as our reality, whether we understand it or not. At the same time, Stanford started the SRI program. Stanford Research Institute started in about 75 and was funded by the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI, among others. And they were doing remote viewing, and that was based on studies that Ryan had begun. And what they found was that Ingo Swann, who was in the same category as Cayce, could actually sit in a room in Stanford and read file names at Langley headquarters. That's really what got the CIA cooking. Now, there were a couple of instances here. One, there was a down backfire bomber in Africa, and there was a race between the Russians and the Americans to find it because of the logbooks. And the remote viewers located it and sent in a SEAL team, and this was acknowledged by President Carter. And there was a secret base in Russia that we overflew with satellites, and we didn't know what they were doing there. And the remote viewers said they were building a submarine, but it was a half a mile from the ocean, and they looked into the future. Which is interesting when you start to get in this shit. They looked into the future and said they're going to blow up a channel in 6 months, and 6 months later they did. Now, when they were doing the testing, Targ and Puthoff would work with Swan, and they would have a system where no one could know where they wanted to go. And Targ would come in and sit with Swan, and Puthoff would get in the car and drive somewhere. And so then Swan at 11 o'clock, wherever Puthoff's standing, go ahead and go draw it. And Swan would draw it. And they did one in Los Angeles, I think, and it was a semi-failure. It was, everything was right, except there was this huge water tower structure in the background. And this was when they were learning about time. And they thought that was one of the failures as they were sorting them. And then somebody looked at the way that picture looked in 1927 with the water tower there before they tore it down in 35. So when Swan was looking at him, he was probably getting a background to an earlier period. So in any event, when Radin, who was sat in the physics chair at Stanford and now is the lead scientist at the Noetic Institute, did a meta-analysis on this, he said the human ability to reach out of the body is a certainty. So now you have our best scientists saying it's something certainly to prove a soul can reach out. This is something a soul would have to do if it was proven by our best science. But this also becomes a bit of a proof on the power of prayer. Because when we go into a church, synagogue, or other religious institutions, we're all on our own harmonic wavelength. And when we sync that harmonic wavelength, we want to influence a future broccoli. We want to influence something in the future. What is broccoli made of?
Yeah, with what?
Well, Lashley at the Yerkes Institute in the late 40s was trying to determine where memory was housed. So what he was doing was he was taking rats to train rats to run a maze, and then he would burn out a specific section of their brain with his wife's curling iron. And he found no matter what part of the brain he burned out, they all were able to run the maze even if they were dragging their legs. And he had an assistant with him named Pibram who worked on the same thing. Pibram went to Yale and then saw an article in the 1960s on holography. Now the way you make a hologram is you take a mirror that's split like this, it's called a beam splitter, and you shoot the laser beam at the beam splitter and it goes in different directions. On the left side, you aim it right at Darcy's camera and you put a piece of holographic film behind Darcy and his camera, and then you reflect that second beam off a mirror and shoot it at the same camera, and what you get is an intersection of the two beams on the subject, and behind it you have a holographic plate, and when it's done you hold up the holographic film and it's just a bunch of squiggly lines. And if you take a laser beam and you shoot it through the holographic film, you get a hologram on the back. But the interesting thing about a hologram is if I cut it in half and I put it over here, I get the whole image on both pieces. I can cut it in 100 pieces, and every piece retains the image of the whole. It degrades a little bit. And what that explained was it gave us a way to understand how consciousness and memory is stored in the body. Now, Jacques Benvenisti in the 90s did a study on basophil degranulation. A basophil is a white blood cell. And when you have an allergen in your body and it attacks, the basophil degranulates, it opens up, it goes, attacks the pathogen coming in. So one of his assistants diluted water so that it had no pathogen as a control, and then put the basophils in and they degranulated. And that was impossible because there was no pathogen in the water. So they repeated the experiments, and he claimed it was because water retained memory. That ultimately got him fired from INSERM, where he was a director. It's the way science works. But what we find is that you are 95% water, you got 4% chemicals. The 4% is really binders that hold the sack of water together. I want to talk about transplant memory here, because once you have memory dispersed through your whole, when somebody dies, and Claire Sylvia in England got 2 replacement lungs from an 18-year-old who died in a motorcycle accident, and immediately after the operation could only think of Tim, wanted chicken McNuggets, and was turned on by women. These images were so strong that she sought out the prior family. Now, ultimately, transplant memories fade because every atom in your body is replaced every 2 years. Your skin sheds off every 6 weeks. Your stomach lining leaves you every day. The enamel in your teeth, the molecules change out. And besides, half of you are bugs anyway. 50% of your cells in your body are other animals. So if you want to define reincarnation, you don't have the body you had at your 6. It's all gone. So in that sense, I've reincarnated 34 times so far. So when we get our ideas about reincarnation, some of the mechanics that we need to have such a thing operate are occurring already, and they're dispersed in other fields, and this is coalescing in a very interesting way. And so if you are nothing but a sack of water with a few binders, and you have a waveform dispersed in you, it may be that the 2% that we're measuring at the Princeton Engineering Research Anomaly Labs may be the part of you that is really you. At least that would indicate that, but there are competing theories, because you know what a wavicle is, right? There's a particle in a wave, and when the probability theory, sometimes it's a particle, sometimes it's a wave, sometimes it's a particle and it's not there, and you're doing how often it's there. That 2% that we just talked about, we may be blocked from seeing it because our basic structure. We talked about a future broccoli, indicating proof of prayer. The next thing I want to talk about is DARPA. DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They're the people who invented the router. Their mission is to do spacey stuff. They were the ones who first developed the microwave. And what they're doing right now is interesting. They're building a plug-in to put information directly into your brain. Now, we already have a plug-in for the optic nerve. We completed that last year. So that means if I'm totally blind and my optic nerve is good, I can put a camera on my shoulder and I can look at all of you. I can look at all of you in ways you can't look at me. Once that's complete, this shit that we're seeing over here, if we sync with the computer on a wavelength, we will develop something called RAIV, R-A-I-V. It is the Remote Artificial Intelligence Viewer. Now, I want to go back to Leeuwenhoek for a second, who was the Dutch guy who invented the microscope. And we could see the stars, so the telescope wasn't as important. When we looked at the sky, we saw the stars, stars made it look better. But when he turned that lens onto a drop of water and saw all those other animals, it opened up a world we did not know exist. And I will tell you, with the convergence of our understanding of what's going on with AI, by 2035, AI will be smarter than human intelligence innately. By 2050, we will be you're able to upload material to the cloud from your computer and down to a new computer. By 2050, we'll be able to upload an amount of data larger than comprises the human mind and body to the cloud and down to whatever is going to house it. And that's our projected development in terms of the technology that we see. So, what's our best explanation of broccoli? What's our reality? When I take the odds against chance on the anecdotal narratives and factor in the experimental consciousness model at 100% based on Radin's meta-analysis, and then add back how your body reincarnates in 2 years on your own, meaning your consciousness in a body that is not 2 years ago, The most probable future after death, then, is what we are being told about it in the anecdotal narrative group. This now, as a common narrative from everybody that's saying everything about this, on the science side of it, the science supports the common religion. The sample size on the aggregate anomaly, 500 million data points and proof of human ability 100%, which is actually 600 million we got over there, indicates that this view is the correct one, and the individual religious views of an afterlife are local variations to the common fact-based position. The religions become regional interpretations of the science. Now you're up against it, because the aggregate result of the observations of our reality is that burkas, kippas, popes, and religious authority figures no longer have religious power but are vestiges of our heritage. Blasphemy laws, apostasy laws are as scientifically dead as divine right of kings. That will be our next generation's reality. That's a change. This model is consistent with the math. You look at the broccoli we laid out. While we don't understand the material or the part of it, we can see. I can look back to a broccoli, I can look forward to broccoli. If it's in a dimension I can't access, but I can see the resulting shadows in my world, I can see a fractal pattern, which only supports what I'm talking about. The math is statistically and fractally sound, something no competing narrative can match, and this narrative syncs, binds, and supports the other narratives, including the religious narratives. But it also leads to this. The best governance is based on wellness because it builds a future nutrient-rich environment to return to. An abundance mentality increases mass wealth, but the result would be the wealth of the 1% would skyrocket. This affects each and every one of us, and it's a clear win-win, which means this science should now be applied to so many places, from the Republican right to the Islamic extremist. What should be done? Personally, I want to believe in this model because it has the most fact-based for me to grab to. But trust but verify. There are a bunch of studies that we can do, but we sure can't get the funding for it currently. We should develop the RAIV model because it's the new telescope. It's a new way of looking at things. If I hook up the best psychic and I can sync the AI to him, and we can expand that wavelength, then I can look for gold in the asteroids or occupied planets, because on a wave frequency, there is no limit, there is no speed limit. I access it, it's whole, it's total to me now. The same way, as a holographic model, the memory is total to me now. A global wellness plan, I want to mention one book to you, Smedley Butler, War is a Racket. What a delightful read. It's short, it's written by a general from World War I who went into government and complained about how much money we pissed away buying mosquito netting for the trenches in France. Just stuff we don't need. So the global wellness plan, and then so we're gonna conclude here. Your continued consciousness is based on a fractal pattern that we can collectively make better or worse. So the result of this talk is that when you walked in here, you were planning the rest of your life, and on leaving, you may now consider planning the next one as well. But managing our collective future is also at stake. Religious standards of good are strangely the protocol for the wellness structure as the plan for future abundance that must be cultivated like a plant. Protected, watered, and nourished, the plant would be healthy and productive, and the owners enriched. This science of reincarnation, coming back to a place that is nutrient-rich, in which I can survive, which I can thrive. And this is simply an irrefutable win-win when addressing how to dispose of corporate money. Should the arts get it, or should we buy a new submarine? This strongly supports the arts. So I'm going to ask you to become a supporter of ISOR, the International Association for the Science of Reincarnation, by telling others about the site. We also have a subreddit, Reincarnation Science. Now I'm going to close with this last thought. By the way, scientifically speaking, you may produce more good by being critical of our site and being critical of the conversation. This is based on scientifically the fact that more people talk about bad things than good ones. Just watch the news, what gets watched more? Hey, something good happened today to a wonderful person, or 5 dead in a huge explosion. So you can support us by telling us that this was really good. You might even be able to support us even better by saying, you know, I really liked it, but this part sucked. And that may actually produce a greater benefit to the organization. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Over and out.